I never thought my job would bring me to this place. A lighthouse on an isolated island, far from everything I knew. The cold, jagged cliffs jutted out from the water like teeth, and the waves below crashed with relentless fury. I had been sent here on assignment as part of an investigation. Something about an abandoned research project that went dark years ago, and the few who returned whispered of strange occurrences. But the details were vague. What I did know was that the island was home to a lighthouse, and that was where my answers lay. The ferry dropped me off at the rocky shore without a word. The captain, a grizzled old man with a face like weathered leather, had only given me a grim nod as I stepped off the boat. I hadn't expected much of a welcome, but the silence felt heavier than I had anticipated. As the ferry disappeared into the mist, the sound of the engine fading away, I was left with nothing but the howl of the wind and the rhythmic boom of the waves. The path ahead wound its way up to the lighthouse, a dark silhouette against the gray sky. I could see it standing tall at the island's highest point. It looked ancient, older than anything I had imagined, with bricks blackened by time and salt, the windows grimy and half-covered in creeping vines. My instincts told me to turn back, but there was nowhere to go now. I was here, and the only way was forward. I trudged along the path, my boots sinking into the wet sand and gravel. Each step felt slower than the last, as if the island itself were pulling me down, trying to keep me from reaching the lighthouse. The wind whipped around me, chilling me to the bone, and as I climbed higher, I began to hear things. At first it was faint, just whispers, carried on the wind. But as I approached the lighthouse, the whispers became clearer. Voices. They sounded like the murmurs of people just out of sight, though no one was there. When I finally reached the base of the lighthouse, the door was slightly ajar. I paused, staring at it for a long moment, feeling a deep unease settle in my gut. Something was wrong here. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. I pushed the door open slowly, and the old hinges groaned like a dying animal. Inside it was dark, save for the faint light that filtered in through the cracked windows. The interior was worse than I had imagined. Rusted metal stairs spiraled up toward the top, and the walls were lined with old faded charts, but everything was coated in dust and grime. My footsteps echoed as I stepped inside, the sound too loud in the oppressive silence. The whispers grew louder now, more distinct. They seemed to be coming from the stairwell, but when I looked up, I saw nothing but the black void above. I climbed, each step creaking under my weight, the air growing colder with every foot. The smell intensified, something rotten, like meat left out in the sun for too long. My head started to pound, a dull ache that throbbed behind my eyes. I shook it off, focusing on the climb. I needed to reach the top. Whatever secrets this place held, they would be there. Halfway up, I found the first signs of life, or rather, death. A chair sat in the corner of a small landing, overturned. Papers were scattered everywhere, and there were deep gouges in the floor, as if something had been dragged violently across it. But it was the blood that caught my attention. Dark, dried streaks smeared across the wall, leading down the stairs. I knelt to examine the stains, but my skin prickled, and I felt something watching me. I turned sharply, but no one was there. Just the shadows stretching long against the walls, flickering with the dim light. I rose and continued upward. The voices were louder now, clearer. I could make out fragments of sentences. He shouldn't have come. It's not safe. The words sent a chill down my spine, but I ignored them. They weren't real. They couldn't be. At the top of the stairs, I found the door to the lighthouse keeper's quarters. It was shut tight, but I could hear movement inside, shuffling, soft and slow. My heart hammered in my chest as I reached for the handle. It was ice cold under my palm, and as I turned it, the door creaked open with a groan that seemed to echo endlessly. The room beyond was a wreck. Furniture was overturned, books and papers littered the floor, and the window at the far end was shattered, letting in the wind and rain. In the middle of the room stood a man, or what was left of him. His back was to me, but I could see that he was dressed in the tattered uniform of a lighthouse keeper. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his hair hung in wet strands over his face. I stepped forward, and the man turned slowly. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. He looked like he had been here for years, trapped in some nightmarish limbo. I froze as our eyes met, and in that moment, I realized he wasn't alive. Not anymore. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words were drowned out by a deafening noise. The lighthouse light above us flickered and spun, casting harsh beams of light across the room. The man's face twisted in agony, and he let out a guttural wail that shook the walls. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. The room began to spin, and the walls seemed to close in around me. The voices were everywhere now, screaming, shouting, pleading. I turned and ran, fleeing down the stairs as fast as I could. But the further I went, the more the space distorted. The stairwell stretched on, twisting in impossible ways, as if the lighthouse itself were alive, trying to trap me. I reached the bottom, breathless and panicked. But something was wrong. The door was gone. The room I had entered was no longer there. Instead, I was in a corridor, a long, narrow hallway lined with doors. Each one was closed, but behind them I could hear the faint sounds of movement, whispers, and the unmistakable sound of something breathing. I backed away, but the hallway stretched on, closing in on me from all sides. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears. I had to get out. I had to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The island had swallowed me whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The air went still, and I found myself standing in front of a single door at the end of the hall. It was old, wooden, with a brass handle worn smooth by years of use. My hand trembled as I reached for it, but I had no choice. I had to know what was behind it. I opened the door. What lay beyond was not the lighthouse, not the island, but something far worse, something that defied explanation. I could see shadows shifting in the darkness, twisted shapes moving toward me, reaching out with cold, bony hands. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen in place. The shadows enveloped me, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was the face of the lighthouse keeper, staring at me from the doorway, his mouth curled into a twisted smile. I had become part of the island, just like him. I was sent to investigate the lighthouse. It was an ordinary assignment, or at least it should have been. A forgotten lighthouse on an isolated island, long abandoned and surrounded by superstition. Local fishermen avoided the area, speaking of strange lights that appeared in the fog, but no one had been there for decades. The stories were dismissed as old wives' tales, and that's where I came in. A professional investigator, sent to catalog the condition of the structure and ensure it was safe before the government auctioned off the property. That's all it was supposed to be. The boat ride to the island was rough, the sea angry beneath a thick blanket of fog. I remember the captain's face, wrinkled and grim, as he gave me one last warning before I disembarked. "Strange place, that lighthouse," he muttered, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Keep to your business and leave before dark. Some things are better left alone." I thought he was just another superstitious local, someone too afraid to face the reality of an empty, forgotten building. But as I stepped onto the rocky shore and watched his boat disappear into the mist, a chill crept over me. I told myself it was the wind, the cold seeping through my jacket, but deep down, something felt off. The lighthouse loomed above, tall and dark against the gray sky, its peak lost in the swirling fog. It had an unnatural stillness about it, as though time had forgotten it, leaving it to stand in perpetual silence. I made my way up the path, my boots crunching on the gravel, and the only sound besides the wind was the distant crashing of waves. The front door was weathered but intact. I pushed it open with a creak that seemed to echo too loudly in the emptiness beyond. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic, like rusted iron. My flashlight flickered as I swept it across the room. The interior was eerily preserved, as if someone had just left. Old furniture was strewn about and papers were scattered on the floor, damp with age. A thick layer of dust covered everything, but nothing looked disturbed. I started my inspection. The walls were solid, the structure itself still in good shape despite years of neglect. But there was something unsettling about the place. The longer I stayed, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. The air was heavy, oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. And then I found the journal. It was tucked away in a drawer in the lighthouse keeper's quarters, its leather cover cracked with age. Inside, the pages were filled with cramped handwriting, the ink smudged in places, but still legible. The entries were dated over a century ago, starting out as mundane observations about the weather and the daily routine of maintaining the light. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. The keeper began describing strange occurrences, lights in the fog that weren't from any ship, shadows moving in the corners of his vision, unexplained sounds at night, footsteps, whispers, things he couldn't explain. His writing grew more frantic, more desperate, until one of the last entries stopped me cold. I don't know what it wants. I see it now, in the shadows, in the walls. It's always there, watching, waiting. I can't leave. I've tried, but the fog won't let me go. It's inside the light now. It's calling me. If anyone finds this, do not stay. The light will never let you leave. I stared at the page, my hands trembling slightly. The words sent a shiver down my spine, and suddenly, the silence around me felt much more sinister. I closed the journal and stuffed it into my bag, suddenly desperate to finish my inspection and get off the island. As I ascended the spiraling staircase to check the lantern room at the top, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My footsteps echoed in the narrow space, but there was something else, a soft creaking, like someone was following just a step behind. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, but there was never anything there. Just the empty stairwell winding below. When I reached the top, the room was as it should be. The glass panes were dirty but intact, and the ancient lantern stood at the center, long extinguished. But as I stepped closer to the window, I noticed something odd. Outside, through the fog, there was a faint light, distant and wavering. There were no other ships, no other lighthouses for miles. I stared at it, my breath fogging the glass, but the longer I looked, the more it seemed to move, shifting, pulsing, growing brighter. The journal's words echoed in my mind, and I stumbled back, heart racing. I had to leave. I hurried down the stairs, my boots clanging against the metal steps, but as I descended, something changed. The air grew thick, humid, and the walls seemed to close in around me. The creaking noise from before was louder now, unmistakable. It wasn't an echo. Someone, or something, was following me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the stairwell, but there was no one. Just shadows. But the shadows moved, twisting unnaturally along the walls, growing darker and closer with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned and sprinted the rest of the way down. I reached the bottom, but the door I had come through, was gone. The entryway was nothing but a solid stone wall, smooth and unbroken. I stood there breathless, staring at the spot where the door had been, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Had I taken the wrong staircase? No, that was impossible. There was only one way up and down. I turned around, my pulse quickening, and that's when I saw it. In the center of the room, the lantern, the one that had been dead for decades, was lit. A pale, flickering flame danced inside, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls, and the whispering began. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, but it grew louder, more distinct. Words I couldn't understand, voices overlapping, whispering, pleading, commanding. They swirled around me, growing louder until they filled the room, pressing in on me from all sides. I backed away, my head spinning, my chest tight with panic. Then the light from the lantern flared, bright and blinding, and the whisper stopped. I blinked, trying to adjust to the sudden darkness that followed. But when my vision cleared, I was no longer in the lighthouse. I was outside, standing on the rocky shore, the lighthouse looming above me. The fog was thicker than before, the air colder, biting at my skin. The island was silent, the only sound the distant crash of waves against the rocks. I took a step forward, and the ground gave way beneath me. I stumbled, falling to my knees, and as I looked down I saw them. Bodies. Dozens of them, half buried in the sand, their faces contorted in terror, their hands outstretched as if reaching for something just out of reach. And there in the center of the pile was the journal I had found. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing. But as I turned to run, the fog closed in around me. I tried to scream, but the air was thick, choking me, pressing in on me from all sides. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was the light from the lantern, flickering in the distance, growing brighter and brighter until it consumed everything. I never left the island. I don't know how long I've been here now. Days, weeks, months, they all blur together. The fog is always here, thick and suffocating, and the light never stops. It calls to me, whispers to me, pulls me closer with every passing moment. I can hear them now, the voices of the others, those who came before me. They're trapped here too, just like I am. And now, if you're listening to this, so are you. I came to the lighthouse for answers, but I never imagined I'd be writing my final words here. It started with a letter, a yellowed, crumpled thing shoved beneath my door one rainy night. No return address, just a single line scribbled in frantic handwriting. Come to the lighthouse. You'll find what you're looking for. For years, I'd been searching for the truth about my brother's disappearance. A fisherman swallowed by the sea, they said. But the details never made sense. His boat had been found adrift, the deck slick with blood, yet there was no body, no sign of a struggle. Just an empty vessel and a creeping sense that something was terribly wrong. The letter felt like a sign. The lighthouse it mentioned was notorious, perched on the farthest edge of the coast, where the land meets the jagged rocks and the waves crash like the earth itself is trying to swallow the sea. Abandoned for decades, it had gained a reputation. A cursed place, locals whispered, though no one could explain why. I didn't care about the rumors. I needed to know. The boat ride out was slow, the fog rolling in thicker than I'd ever seen, a blanket of gray that swallowed the horizon. The lighthouse rose from the mist, a solitary tower of black stone, looming like a skeletal finger pointing to the heavens. As I approached, the air grew cold, unnaturally so, biting through my coat and chilling me to the bone. I stepped off the boat onto the slick, moss-covered rocks. The lighthouse seemed to watch me, its windows dark and empty like soulless eyes. I almost turned back then, but something pulled me forward. Curiosity? Desperation? I don't know, but I had come too far to leave without answers. The door groaned as I pushed it open, the smell of salt and rot hitting me in a wave. Inside, the walls were damp, streaked with grime, the air thick with decay. The floors creaked under my boots, and as I walked deeper into the lighthouse, I noticed something strange. The light at the top was still functioning, a dim, pulsing glow that flickered in and out like a dying heartbeat. No one had manned this place for decades. I should have turned around right then. I should have left, but something, a whisper in my mind, a voice I couldn't place, urged me to keep going. I began climbing the spiral staircase, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the silence. About halfway up, I heard it. A low, rhythmic sound like something breathing, slow, steady, and wet. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. The noise seemed to come from the walls themselves, like the very stone was alive, exhaling and inhaling in time with my pulse. My heart raced, but I forced myself to move forward. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the air around me thickened with something unseen. I reached the top and pushed open the door to the lantern room. The light flickered weakly, casting long, jagged shadows across the space, and then I saw it. In the corner, where the floor met the wall, there was a dark stain. Blood. Fresh blood. My throat tightened as I followed the smear, my eyes tracing the trail up the wall to the window. And there, pressed against the glass, was a handprint. Small, like a child's, but twisted and elongated, fingers too long, nails too sharp. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and that's when the whispers began. Not the whisper from the letter. No, this was different. 100 voices, murmuring in unison, too quiet to understand, but loud enough to make my skin crawl. I backed up toward the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The light overhead flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness, then sputtering back to life in a sickly, greenish hue. And then, the breathing returned. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was behind me. I turned slowly, every instinct in my body screaming to run. Standing in the center of the room was something. I don't know how else to describe it. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its skin stretched too tight, pale and slick like it had been drowned. And its eyes were black voids, endless and empty, as if they absorbed all the light around them. It didn't move, but the breathing continued, slow and deliberate, filling the room with the sound of wet air being sucked through rotted lungs. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. I stood there, paralyzed, staring into those eyes, feeling them draw me in, deeper and deeper, until I was drowning in that darkness. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally broke free, the creature was gone. The door was open, swinging on its hinges as though nothing had happened. I bolted down the stairs, not caring about the creaks or the groans of the old building around me. I needed to get out. But when I reached the bottom, the front door, the one I had come through, was gone. There was just a wall where the exit had been, solid stone, cold and unyielding. Panic surged through me as I pounded my fists against it, shouting for help, for anyone to hear. The walls seemed to shift, to breathe again, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. My breath came in ragged gasps as I spun around, searching for another way out. But the room wasn't the same. The staircase was gone. The floor was uneven, shifting under my feet like it was alive, and the air was thick with the smell of rot and something far worse. Something ancient. And then I saw it. A mirror, hanging on the wall where there had been none before. In the reflection, I saw the lighthouse, but it wasn't empty. The room behind me was filled with people. No, not people. Corpses. They stood there, twisted and deformed, eyes sunken, flesh rotting, but their faces were familiar. My brother was among them. I stumbled back, choking on the rising bile in my throat. The reflection showed them staring at me, their mouths moving in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. But when I turned around, the room was empty. There were no bodies, just me, alone. I ran to the mirror, my hands shaking as I reached for it, but the glass was cold, solid. And then, just as my fingers touched it, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Ice cold, sharp nails digging into my skin. I spun around, and there it was again. The thing from the lantern room, its eyes boring into mine, its breath hot and rancid against my face. I screamed, but no sound came out. The creature's mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, and it whispered a single word. Just one. Stay. The walls around me began to close in, the ceiling sinking lower, the air growing thicker until I couldn't breathe. I clawed at the stone, but there was no escape. The lighthouse had me now, just like it had taken my brother, just like it had taken everyone else. And now I'm here, writing this. My final words, in the hope that someone will find them. But you won't leave either. You'll come for answers, just like I did. And the lighthouse will take you too, because that's what it does. It doesn't just keep the light, it keeps us, forever.